welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Pastor Jon, and today I'm leading the convo with my partner, Pastor Rusten.
What's up?
How you doing?
Doing good.
So we said this in the previous episode, but you preached yesterday.
Yep. Amos 2.
And then you had group Sunday night. So how are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good. It was a really fun life group because it honestly felt like a party because the Overtons go to our life group, and so it was the Overtons with their 2 kids and us with Knox, and so it was a life group plus a party to celebrate the baptisms. So
yeah,
that was fun. That was cool. And it was
the infant baptisms.
Yeah, and it was there was a lot of people there. Because our life group is growing, we had more people than we've ever had, and so it was a big soup night. Because our host, the Petricks, were like, "How are we going to feed all these people? People got to bring soup is good because it like goes a long way." So it was fun. It was good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It was a special day. And you preached, so I got to have the day off, and
yep,
that was fun.
Well,
it was
sort of. You got to do some baptisms.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I got to do the baptisms. First time ever, infant baptism. So that was awesome. But yeah, so you preached and you took Amos chapter 2.
Yep.
And there is a distinct transition that takes place in Amos 2. So let me set it up a little bit and then we'll get after some of the unique content. Okay.
Got it.
So I imagine, and I think you said this in your sermons, I imagine an Israelite listening to Amos go after all these surrounding nations for all the things that they had done and all the things that they had witnessed. And Amos goes after Damascus, and Israel's like, and then they goes after Gaza and Tyre and go get them, God, you go, Amos, go.
Yeah.
And then you've got Edom and the Ammonites and Moab, right? And it's like, so Amos, when he comes out of the gate, he is pronouncing judgment on these pagan nations. And what you said, many of these nations had done harm to Israel. And some of the specific things are acts that were done against the people of Israel. So it's like, go get them, God.
Yep.
And then it just turns. And now no longer is Amos addressing these pagan nations, but now he's addressing Israel. He's addressing Judah and Israel. But though they had splintered, it's interesting when you get into chapter 3, it's like Amos doesn't care about the splinter.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Because they're still one people, but he's addressing them as different kingdoms because they did have different issues. But there's almost like you can imagine the whole room going silent at that point. And it's very much the same way that the Apostle Paul kind of comes out of the gate swinging in Romans 1, where he's talking about all these sins and you've exchanged the truth for a lie. You've suppressed the truth, exchanged God's glory. And then he talks about sexual perversion and all the different things that come as an effect of that. And then he gets to chapter 2.
Yep.
And you are no better, right? He's looking at the congregation at that point. So that transition happens very early into chapter 2. Amos is no longer talking about unbelieving nations who do not have a covenant, who do not have the law. He's now talking to God's people.
Yep.
And that changes how he addresses them. Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little bit about the difference between the way Amos goes after nations and what he goes after versus the way he's going after Judah and Israel, and what are the things that he's actually getting at?
Yeah, well, one of the distinct things that Amos addresses is their specific covenant requirements, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of similarities, especially once you get into the Israel part of it, because Israel's doing a lot of things that would still fall under that, category of, just moral abuses of your neighbor, right? But but you see this specifically in Judah, which what happened to Judah already had happened to Israel, right? Like the thing that they are condemned for is rejecting his law, right? And that was the law of the covenant, the law that revealed who God was, and no longer walking in his statutes, and walking in lies instead, and the same lies that their fathers had walked in. So there's a change in. It's not the change in like the tone. The tone is like the same. Like he's like it's fiery roaring, right? But the specifics of Judah and Israel's sins is not just that they sinned against this common revelation of God in the conscience and in nature. It's you have sinned against what I have done for you by grace, right? I've revealed myself to you. I've entered into covenant with you, and that was all by grace, and you are rejecting that. So there's a change in the content of what they are being called out in. But what you see between Judah and Israel is that Judah is more addressed for that content difference. Israel has so walked down the rejecting the covenant that they look just like the pagan neighbors. In fact, they might even be described as worse, because there's a lot more stuff being unpacked in the pronouncement against the kingdom of Israel than in even any of the other kingdoms.
Yeah. So you talked, and when he gets to chapter 3, it's I don't want to get it too far ahead, but it's like if you can imagine the gavel hitting harder, like it's coming. And I think one of the things, I think you said this, is like God is judging these pagan nations, and Israel doesn't get off the hook.
Yes. Yep.
They don't get a freebie because they're in the covenant.
Yep. That's the thing that Amos, I think, is attacking, is that notion. This is the same thing that like you see even in the New Testament, where Jesus talks to the Pharisees and he's like, you think that you are going to be saved because you're children of Abraham, but like he's able to call up children out of these stones. Like you are not special in terms of special, meaning I am somehow outside of God's jurisdiction of judgment. You have a covenant with God, but you're going to be judged by that covenant on top of the standard of righteousness that I've given to everybody.
Yeah.
So no one escapes judgment, even the covenant people.
Yeah.
One of the things that maybe we'll get into this a little later is like, I think that covenant piece needs to be unpacked a little bit, because I think that there are some confusing applications that we might have in our minds about what it means to be in covenant with God. Like I think that a lot of people might think that to be in covenant with God just means that I'm good. I have God as my righteousness. I have the faith. And it's like actually this covenant people has this special relationship with God, but you do not actually experience the benefits of that special relationship if you don't have the faith that is necessary on your side. The faith that says, I do trust, I do put all of my hope, and that faith will produce the obedience of the covenant in even in imperfect ways, because God cleanses even our best obedience, right? But the faith that follows the obedience that follows the faith is a sign of true faith being present. And that's the same thing with the church today.
Yeah. It's exactly what James is talking about.
Exactly.
When you have a faith that doesn't produce good works or obedience and righteousness, that's not a genuine faith. It's not the kind of faith that can save, right?
Yes.
So I want to say it was a Pussy quote. Am I saying his last name right?
Yes.
Pussy.
Yeah.
I actually read some of him today. I think it was him that was describing this idea that Israel thought that election made them God's was it pet? Was that the right word? Was that?
I think that was actually, I think, a Matir quote. But but he like they had believed, they had degraded God's election into a form of like I'm now God's pet, and I only experience his imperial preference. Like there's a favoritism, right? Like meaning to be God's people means God's going to put aside his standards for me, right? That's the false notion that Israel was believing. Like I'm in covenant with God, so that means I'm good.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Good. And that was a chronic problem for Israel. That wasn't isolated to just this instance. There was a failure to understand that, and I'm going to get into this actually this week, that being elect and being part of the covenant actually puts a greater responsibility on you for obedience.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
You're in covenant now. It's just like when God comes down at Sinai and says, do these things. And then what does Israel say? We'll do them. Right.
Yes.
So guess what? Now you have to do them.
Yeah. Yep.
Now you have to do them. And that's not to be confused with like justification through works. It's not works that make them the people of God. It's God's grace in saving them and redeeming them and rescuing them that makes them his people and brings them into the covenant. But then there is the expectation of fruit.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Fruitfulness.
Fruitfulness that flows from faith. And another word I think for that in the Old Testament uses a lot is, like the fear of God, right? Like I think that faith, when we think about faith, I think that there's a good argument to be made that the counterpart, another way of saying that in the Old Testament, that the Old Testament uses a lot, is the fear of God. Like there's no fear of God before their eyes. And if you look at the pronouncements that Judah has on Judah or on Israel, like they're not looking at God as like, this is the number one important thing. I look to God for for my good. I look to God for warnings. I look to God for my justification, my righteousness. Like all those things flow from this fear of God that is just not even present in Judah and Israel, at least not present in a way that is dominant. Right? Like you always have a remnant of people who do, right? Like even I think about Elijah and Ahab, during that time, like Elijah thinks there's nobody who fears God.
Nobody else.
And God's like, I have like, is it 7,000 men who have not
bowed the knee.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, I don't know if you remember this, but there's a longer list for Israel. Obviously there's 10 tribes there.
Yeah.
But when you read the list, it sounds very similar to kind of Jesus's indictments, which are not always against Israel as a whole, but are often aimed at the priesthood and the perversions of in worship.
Yep.
And there seems to be a lot of that in the things that Amos calls out against Israel. And that's not to say that not everybody's part of that, but there's some do you remember what they are? Or could you speak to any of those?
Oh, well, I think about specifically, in the very beginning, you have language around selling selling the righteous for silver and the innocent for sandals. And, everybody I've read on that part says this is either talking about actually selling people into slavery, but it's probably more likely having to do with judges that were taking bribes. And during Israel's time, that would have actually been like the priesthood class or people who were, in a position that was tightly connected to the priesthood class. And so there is a kind of like, I'm perverting justice, but I'm also an emissary of God. Right. And so that's one example. Another one is the indictment around, you could even say the sexual stuff is connected here because, a father and a son going to the same woman. Well, there are some people who think that's just a reference to rampant, sexual perversion. But some people also think that that's because the priesthood class had kind of like taken the pagan rituals around them. Like, that's kind of cool. Let's do that too. And so you had priestesses that were being associated with worship who, like part of like the sacrament of the pagans was to have these, like fertility rites where you were going into the same woman, right? Like it was just like one person whose job it was to receive that. And it was a form of worship in these pagan rites. So that's another one. Another one would be the the taking a garment in pledge, that was just a straight up law for God's people. Like, you don't take a garment in pledge and keep it overnight, because if you have your neighbor's garment overnight, he has nothing to sleep in and he's cold. So just like normal, like, love your neighbor stuff, but it gets put in the context of what appears to be, again, the priest class, because they're taking garments in pledge and then they're sleeping on them. And where are they sleeping? They're sleeping next to the altar.
Yeah.
Right. So who sleeps next to the altar? Well, priest. I mean, there's some stuff that I'm like, how does that work? Why are we sleeping next to altars? But I'm like, but the closeness to the altar there tells me there's something religious going on there as well. And then
and I think it also speaks to the brazenness of it.
Yes.
Like when you're, even if it's not literally happening, it's a way of saying you're violating the law right next to the altar.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And then the last one is the actually there might be two more, but the last one that is in this same series of very similar pronouncements is that they take the fines and they use the fines to buy wine, and they drink it in the house of their god. So, unpacking that a little bit, God's
alcohol's
law,
bad.
No, yeah, exactly. Like, you could totally take Amos 2, and there's a couple references in Amos 2 that make you go, oh, Amos doesn't like wine or alcohol. It's like he also condemns them for making the Nazarites drink wine. But that's not the context.
Separate thing. Yeah.
What you have here is their fines were for restitution, right? Anytime there's a fine in the Bible, it's because you did something to somebody else, and you need to both learn your lesson to not do that, and you need to make it right with your neighbor. And so if you stole something from your neighbor, right? Let's just say you stole $10, right? You're supposed to pay that $20 back, right? Isn't that what it is? The pay back and double, right?
Yeah,
and so
in Exodus, when you have the codes, sometimes it's double, sometimes it's 4. Depending on the particular item. But yes, it's not just a paying back it was stolen. You're losing
more.
what you hope to gain.
Exactly.
That's the punitive part of it. Because if you just return what you stole, it's not costing you anything.
I just gotta try again and not get caught.
That's right.
So but the key thing being here that fines were used for restitution. They went to the people offended. And what you see here is that the fines are not going to the people offended. Who are they going to then? Well, they're going to whoever is saying the fines need to be paid, or at least a portion of them. And Amos's description of this is people who take the fines and they store it up, and then they go and buy wine, and they're drinking it somewhere. They're drinking in the house of their god. So there's a kind of I think there's an indication there that the priesthood class, which was also the class that would, mitigate certain issues, was like, hey, this is a great opportunity. We can actually find a little extra, and we can, line our own pockets with that. And, you see the same thing actually in the New Testament. I actually think this is, we've both read Jerry Boyer's work, and
yes,
gosh, his book, The Maker versus the Takers.
Go read that. It's short.
It's so good.
Oh my gosh. And you almost feel stupid for not seeing those things in the Gospels.
Yes.
Before, about regions and money and particular sins and what it is that, gotta go read it.
It is a theological meditation on the economics given to us in the New Testament. So, but there's a lot of there's a very similar thing happening here with the fines, because that Boyer calls out in the New Testament, and it's kind of similar also to what Judas does when the perfume is broken open and poured on Jesus. He's all mad because he's like, hey, this could have been sold, and we could have fed the poor with it. And then I think, is it John who makes that? Addresses that. He's like, well, that's because he liked to steal from the poor bag. And so what's going on there is you have a problem in the world that is being used as the context where I can, line my own pockets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And same thing, there's someone steals from somebody. Problem becomes an opportunity for the ruling or priest class to then line their own pockets. And so, the fines get bigger. People are not maybe even paid back the restitution that, according to God's law, that they are owed.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the people who are in charge, which I think we both agree is the priest class, using it, and they're making a perversion of God's law in that regard. And the last thing I just say, this is the one I was like, this is kind of another example of it, is you have the people not wanting to hear the prophets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not wanting to hear, and then also wanting to like shut down these Nazarites who are making vows. And it's almost like you can almost see this kind of as a similarity to, today. It's not uncommon for people, seminarians, right, to do this very thing, right? Like I get the most heat from speaking clearly stuff that Christians believed in the last 2,000 years, right? Not from the pagan next door, but from the person who went to seminary and has a degree and is defending their version and understanding of what, love is according to what they learned in seminary. And so there's a kind of like, who were the people who were trying to silence the prophets? Well, if the prophets were talking about the corruption of the priest class, might have been the priest class.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, that's what happened with Jesus's time. It was not the people who were the most wanting to shut down Jesus was not the man on the street. It was the Pharisees. It was the priests. It was, so I think that there's another example there.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that the garment and the altar and the Nazarite vow and the wine, all of those seem to be painting this picture of you have a very perverted religious system and system of worship in which the way the outside world does it is now reflected in Israel. And specifically with you mentioned like the father and his son go into the same woman, and I agree with you. I don't think it's talking about some weird relationship or one night stand thing. I think it's talking about what was very common in the surrounding nations, which was sexual acts at the temple as a religious rite, as a way of worship, as a way of offering. That was very normal.
Yeah,
And
which is just to be clear on that a little bit, like that doesn't happen first as a religious thing, right? It happens first as a just normal sinful lust thing, and then it's like you can imagine like the Israelites being like, "Hey, I kind of like the idea of that right, because because the passions within create flock to the lie that is somewhere else, right?" So it's like, and I say that because I think that there is a tendency, even in the debates around homosexuality today, the fact that we're even having debates is hilarious. But like there's a tendency to want to go see this. What the New Testament is really against is the religious use of these things. Yeah. And it's like, well, they become religious because it's the perverted human heart wanting to project that in such a way that it is affirming their sin, right? I think when I read material on this, I was like, oh man, he gets at this. Like he emphasizes like it was probably some sort of temple rites, but the temple rites themselves are just the like outward permission of what is already going on in the human heart.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I was going to say that pagan nations canonized two things almost always. One, sexual perversion. The other is child sacrifice.
Yes. Yeah.
Those are two things that they always say. These are musts.
Yes.
And then part of the problem in the history of Israel is that they follow those examples.
Yes.
But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I totally agree with your assessment on that. So that kind of brings me to the last thing, because I think we're approaching the end here.
Cool.
You talked about apostasy, and you can see the down the road fruit of apostasy, these drastic things that are happening, right?
Yep.
But apostasy is way more secret than that in terms of how it starts.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about a little bit of how apostasy starts, and maybe if you guys see examples of that today, where you do not have a full out rejection of God, but you have the steps of that are following the steps of Israel. So
and one of the things I did when I talked about this is that the pronouncements against Judah, followed by the pronouncements against Israel, kind of give us a good roadmap, right? Because Judah is going to end up in the same place as Israel, but they're about 150 years behind Israel. And so there's okay, well, what does it look like when you're 150 years behind, the perversion that is rampant in Israel? Well, it looks like you can see the beginning steps. And the beginning steps in Judah are they reject God's law, right? They don't walk in his statutes, and they believe lies, right? And that's super helpful, because that can happen so easily without even realizing it, because it can happen in a way that you think is innocent, right? And I brought up it's very easy to treat the Bible as like a buffet, right? Like, you
that was
pick
super
and
helpful.
choose things you like, things that suit your taste, and you reject a bunch of stuff that you either find embarrassing, you kind of cringe at, you think, and I'm not talking about stuff that is like, difficult to understand, right? Like, some of us get to stuff in the Bible and it is legitimately difficult to just understand the grammar, right? And like, what is actually being said here, or to reconcile something in one place with another place, and we have to do some theological and exegetical work. Like, that's not what I'm talking about.
Or having like legitimate convictions that are maybe both are honoring the word. So for example, like baptism, we'd say, hey, the created people are making a biblical case, and the paid people are making a biblical case, and so that's a good example, but that can go really bad.
So there are instances we have where we're wrestling with the word, but we all want to honor the word, right? And that's different from the word says something and I don't like it. It's pretty clear. I mean, it clearly says something and I don't like it, and I'm either going to ignore it, be embarrassed by it, or whatever it is that you read a passage and you know what it says, and you go, ugh, I don't like that. That's an example of where it starts, right? The heart saying, I think I know a better way than God, right? And that's and if you do that, what you're doing, and you're that picking and choosing, what you're doing is you're actually just crafting a word of God like Thomas Jefferson did, right? We're just cutting out the stuff he doesn't like. Right. And what he's left with is not the Bible, it's the Jefferson Bible. It's Jefferson and just reaffirming like a mirror all the things that he already believes. And so I think you and I have both said this at different times, but like, you're encountering God truly when you read his word and it disagrees with you, and you have to and you're left with what do I do when it clearly disagrees with me? Well, there's a choice there. Are you going to humble yourself under his word, or are you going to push back against it? One of the things I tell I in the youth group, I've mentioned this we should have a conviction about the Bible that we don't have any problem texts, not texts that are difficult to understand, but texts that we have a problem with, right? And we should, once we understand what something says, we should say, this is good, this is true, this is right, this is beautiful. Like, if I disagree with that, something is wrong with me. And since we all just basically agree with depravity and that we're all sinners, that should be we should be able to accept that. Right? So so it begins there. It begins with saying, I think I know better than God. Did God really say? It begins with those things. And no, that's Romans 1 as well. That's, we know the truth and we're suppressing it.
Yeah.
So that's the first step. And there's a progression to it, because once you start there, that it doesn't end there. It keeps going. Things are subtle at first. You think you read something in the Old Testament, like, man, that's pretty harsh. I don't like that. And then you start playing defense with the Bible with your non-Christian friends, and then after a while, you're not playing defense anymore. You're kind of playing offense, right? And you're constantly in a position of like trying to justify these other views that are like just have like, where'd they come from? They're so reflective of the world around us, not the Bible, and not Christianity for the last couple thousand years. So what is that? And that just grows and grows and grows until it's something like the brazenness we see in Israel. Or you said to give some examples today, like the brazenness we see in the mainline denominations that are flying pride flags right next to the cross, right? It's a mockery, but it's almost like they have rejected the thing that they're mocking, so they're actually trying to create something new entirely. Right? And there's a kind of like, 𝐁-𝐒𝐢𝐝, who was, I mentioned Princeton in my sermon because I was thinking about 𝐁-𝐒𝐢𝐝 here, because 𝐁-𝐒𝐢𝐝 was a professor at Princeton when it was being overtaken by the liberal theologians who were like rejecting the resurrection, the veracity of the Bible, and stuff like that. And 𝐁-𝐒𝐢𝐝 wrote a book called Christianity and Liberalism. And his point was that this new thing that is, being accepted under the umbrella of Christianity is not even close to Christianity anymore. It's a new thing entirely. It's its own religion, Christianity and liberalism, meaning there's two different things here. So that and one of the things that's helpful about noting this progression of like starting small and then it grows. And you brought up the 𝐁-𝐸 progression in one of your previous sermons. I can't remember what the name of that article is, but it's so helpful in identifying the actual steps that this takes. And, I would just commend that to people, because I think it's such a good expose of this movement towards apostasy, where you're just like, you're proclaiming something, but you're kind of like maybe slightly embarrassed by it. And then you stop proclaiming it. And then, you're the next step is like, you just reject it. And then the next thing is that you're actually fighting against those who proclaim the thing that you apparently proclaimed in the beginning. And we've probably, and I've felt this over the last several years, that I haven't changed very much in my beliefs. I believe for the most part the same things about specifically morals and what God's word says is right and wrong. I believe pretty much the same things I have since I was taught them as a kid at this, the Baptist church I went to, right? But I haven't changed in those things, but a lot of my friends have, and it's like I'm an extremist because I believe the things that they believed with me when we were, in Awanas together or whatever. Like it's weird because you think an extremist would be like a new thing popping up. It's like, I'm just doing the same thing we all did back in that Baptist Sunday school, believe the same thing. But you're the one who's moved. You've moved down this road. So that's an interesting thing as well. And I think that the comparing of Judah and Israel is helpful because it teaches us to just be ever on guard, right? Because if it starts small and it starts among people who might generally be thought to be the more faithful camp, like Judah was the more faithful camp, generally speaking, in terms of the entire nation. But the rot was already there in small ways compared to Israel. And so there's a kind of like, I think it's important to call out the mainline denominations for their just brazen perversion. But it's also a warning, right? When you see it, it should be a warning to go, well, we must never, ever take those steps. Because it's the same, we need to not be a people who cringe at God's word.
Yep.
We need to not have problem texts. We need to just, and that's a constant fight for faith. And I think I brought up the Hebrews passage about, take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil and unbelieving heart.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and every day, examine your heart, and lest you be fallen into the hardness of heart that comes from the deceitfulness of sin. It's just very, so when you look at something outside of yourself, go, oh, like you're not supposed to go, I can't talk about that. No, you should talk about that. But you also should talk about that knowing that you need to be continually rooting out any, steps that you might be taking in the same direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I had a conversation. This is reminding me of a conversation I had today earlier with a buddy, and he's a pastor in Seattle, and we were just kind of lamenting how there are so few, if any, actually complementarian churches left. And there are churches that were, for years had been complementarian, guys that we knew personally that were complementarian, that were solid in that, and they just one after another have fallen. And they become egalitarian, and they are ordaining women as pastors or elders, or the thing that's happening right now is people are doing some gymnastics to say, well, elder and pastor are completely different things. So
reminds me of gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
It's like,
an elder couldn't be, a woman couldn't be an elder, but there's nothing that prohibits her from being a pastor. And my friend, he just said, he goes, I don't know what you have to do to turn in, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, to turn that to, I do permit a woman, right? What do you have to do to get there? And the reason I'm bringing that up is like, there are specific things and specific lies and errors that the church faces at particular times. They're not typically all dealing with the same problem, or with all different problems. There's kinds of cultural waves of ideology that go through, and then the church gets caught up in it.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And right now, those waves is gender, and it's the sexuality issue. And there is a posture of embarrassment about what the New Testament clearly teaches regarding the qualifications of an elder and the different roles between men and women in the church. That's God's design. It's good. But there's a process to the eventual apostasy, which is, and this is what Kevin DeYoung talks about, is like, well, how do you get to rejecting God's law? Well, first of all, you're embarrassed a little bit by it. And then you're just not going to talk about it. And then you're going to argue with people who are saying things that Christians have believed for 2,000 years. Right. And then eventually you're going to find yourself apostate. You're going to give up the whole thing.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen overnight.
No.
And I think that's the warning, is like, you need to be vigilant about your own heart and God's word, and receiving all of it by faith, in gratitude. It is good. It is loving. And you kind of got to exercise the muscle of saying it. Right? That comes up in Amos. Like, you got to say these things out loud. Right. I think there's a lot of people who, well, they believe these things, but they don't want to say it out loud. It's like, if you don't use that muscle, you're going to lose it. And pretty soon you're not going to believe it anymore.
Yeah. At Life Group last night, we were talking about this very thing. And I had mentioned, I was like, it's really a good practice to occasionally go out for coffee with one of those people who thinks you're a Nazi because of what you believe.
Yeah.
And just like have coffee with them and just tell them straight up, like face to face, why you think they're wrong. And just, I believe the Bible, and like, that's what I believe. And it's, I actually think that everything you are saying contrary to it is destructive and evil. And just to like, they'll either walk away going like, well, I'm kind of glad we had this conversation. I disagree with you, but like, they're like in a state of confusion, right? Because
Yeah.
they were expecting to talk to somebody who was going to like, was looking to obliterate, whatever the people.
Yeah.
And it's just good to, and here's it's exercising the muscle, right? Because the muscle is let somebody think something about you that's not true, contradict them in person, and they still disagree with you, and then you go away going, not like, there we go. I just, like, that was me making bold witness to this person, and receiving all their condemnations in person, which they're less likely to be as heated in that environment. But like, just get used to it, because otherwise you're going to cave.
That's right.
And one of the things that we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to say this about, like, the women's ordination thing is a good example. And I think when I brought up this stuff about being embarrassed or like, playing defense, I'm not doing that from not being aware of what that's like, right? Like, I have held and I hold to that men are called to be pastors and only men. But I can definitely remember a time where I was explaining that to somebody and I was almost apologizing for what the Bible was saying. Yeah. And like, I'm trying to, like, it is very true that many women can teach just as well or better than men. Like, just like, but this is just so happens to be what God says. So I guess that's, I can't change that. Maybe if I could, I would, like that kind of like way of approaching it. And I think that when you're talking about examining your heart and like interrogating your heart, when you do that, something has gone wrong. So, and ask yourself, like, Lord, help, ask the Lord, like, help me to not actually like even feel this way about your word, because that's messed up. Like, my affections are messed up. So help me to just know that what you say is good. It's the best. It's what the world desperately needs, because the world needs to, walk in how God says things ought to be, not how we feel it might be. So I bring that up just because I think it's easy to say, to say that, but it's like, no, I know what that's like to be in that defense mode. And then I've noticed that and been like, that's wrong. What is wrong with me? And repented. And now, like, it's just, I'm, now I can speak confidently, and I don't feel like I'm calling somebody to something second rate, like, because we're not calling people to something second rate when we call them to what God says. Right. Never. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. You're calling them to freedom and truth, and vitality and righteousness,
abundant life. It's like, everything that he says for us that we should walk in is good. It's for our good, and it's true, and it's beautiful. So, like, if I don't think it is, something's wrong with me.
There you go. Yeah. Well, why don't you send us out on that final note?
Thanks, everybody, for listening to Sermon B-Sides. Until next time, trust Christ, go to church, and love your neighbor. See ya.